Hi, everybody. Back. Your isolated professor. Hope you all doing fine out there in isolation land. Um, it is what it is until it isn't, and then it'll be something else. Anyway, I'll make this hopefully short tonight. I'm going to talk about it is Friday, TGIF. Does it matter anymore? All the days running together. I don't have to be anywhere. Just hanging at the house, play my guitar, paint my paintings, writing a new novel. Do you guys even read out there? Maybe I'll finish the novel in time when you're retiring from your jobs when you're 60. It'll be done by then. Anyway, tonight we're going to be talking about the Western, and one of the cornerstone genres of Hollywood films. Now, other countries made Westerns in their own way. They were copying our Westerns. I'll talk about those in a second. Because they didn't have the Old West. Sorry, there was no Old West in Europe. Now, the Japanese had a feudal system and they had samurais. They were very much like our gunfighters, and they roamed the land. So there were similarities there. Australia had some cowboys, but really the Western landscape is a U.S. Domain, and some of our farthest reaching tour directors of old Hollywood, not that new Hollywood I talked about in the 60s and 70s, that was different. The other tour directors worked for the studio system, and somehow they got their personal stamp on these films. Even though they didn't have the control, studios controlled it, but their personal stamp was so strong that people look forward to seeing a John Ford movie, a Howard Hawks movie, and the rest. So we're going to talk about that today. And during the early parts of cinema, we weren't that far from actual Old West. I mean, there was one of the first silent films ever made, The Great Train Robbery, bank robbery, is a silent film. You can look it up. You can watch it on YouTube. It's a few minutes long. It's a Western about a banditos robbing a train. Pretty simple story, but most Westerns are sort of simple. They reduce the complexity of humankind down to good and bad. But that changed with filmmakers like John Ford when he made Stagecoach, which you guys wrote about. And the characters became complex, and they were considered adult stories, just so happened to be set in the Old West. Now, when they were making these films, the Old West was only a generation before. And so the memories and the accuracy of let's just say the set designs and the outfits, the hats, was more accurate. We've gotten so far away from that now. If anybody saw the remake of Magnificent Seven, it's like they're rock stars. They wear black leather pants and they have cool gloves. That never happened. Look at the Old West photos, folks. There was no designer black leather pants in the Old West. But it looks cool. And so the Westerns now are just kind of faux Westerns. Still good against bad. It's still a lot of gunplay. And John Ford wasn't just about gunplay. It seems like any modern sort of Western, when I say modern, the last 30 years, it's all about the guns. And even Clint Eastwood's, elegy Western, The Unforgiven, it's all about, there's a lot of gunplay in it. Is that all we watch it for, is the violence? I'm not sure. Are they trying to get across a different message? Clint was. He was, for sure. But it was a lawless land. And so you could get away with shooting somebody, probably. Um, but John Ford told a complex story in Stagecoach. He went on to tell many, many Western stories. He had a great run of Westerns in the 40s, what they call the Calvary Trilogy. And we move that. The Calvary Trilogy was set in the military. The cavalry that was patrolling the Great Western Plains, protecting Americans, farmers from the Native American Indians. And he made three really, they call them the Calvary Trilogy, the Fort Apache, which to me is the best of the trilogy, Rio Grande, I'm completely forgetting the third trilogy one. Anyway, I'll come up with it in a second. Anyway, and these are very complex stories about men in changing times. Men who are living out in the Western Plains in very isolated areas. They drink hard. They play hard. They die hard, and they kill hard. But they try to maintain some sort of civility throughout. Should wear a yellow ribbon. Got it. John Wayne stars in all three of these movies. He's not the star of each one. He's definitely was in that one. Fort Apache starred Henry Fonda, and John Wayne was in it. But John Wayne is brilliant. Actually, really, he plays an aging cavalry officer who's about ready to retire, and he's going to do one more thing to try to keep peace between the Indians and the settlers. And it's a beautiful. It depicts a beautiful, elegiac end of an era type of melancholy that John Ford was known for, and filmed in his beloved Monument Valley location, which he loved to film there. Later on, he did another great film called My Darling Clementine with Henry Fonda, and it's about the Wyatt Earp and the gunfight at OK Corral. It's not historically accurate, but it's really, once again, full of longing for a time that's long forgotten. It's even longer forgotten now. These movies were made in the 40s. So when he was making them, they were the West was forgotten, but not long forgotten. And Wyatt Earp, the gunfight of OK Corral, and depicting that in his usual nuanced human way. Not always about the gunplay, more or less about the complexity of men who can settle their arguments with guns, if need be. Later on, as he got into the 50s, his ideas about the West changed. They became harder, meaning he wasn't naive anymore, and he started having sympathy for Indians and the Native American. And to me, his last great Western film is called The Searchers with John Wayne. John Wayne is a returning Civil War sort of hero, and his whole family is wiped out by the Indians, and his niece is kidnapped, young Natalie Wood from Rebel Without a Cause, if you remember seeing that. One of her first roles, and he spends the rest of the movie with his sidekick, who was a half-breed Indian, and that was really a no-no, Jeffrey Hunter, and they spend years trying to track down this kidnapped daughter. And when he finally finds her, he is so enraged by Native Americans, racist to his core, You don't know if he's going to save her or put a bullet in her head because she'd been living with a man as his wife. That means she's been violated by a red man. But it ends the way it should end. And everything's good. Everybody goes home, except for John Wayne is closed out of his house because he's a man without a home. He's a man without a house. And the last shot of the searchers is classic. John Wayne standing in the doorway with his back to the camera as he looks out onto the endless horizon, and you wonder what's going to happen to this man because he's out of a place in time. And in time, the place in history has no room for this people like this anymore. And then the door slowly closes, and it's a theatrical device, like the curtain coming down, and that's the beauty of the shot. Anyway, John Ford directed many, 150 features, a lot of features that were not Westerns, but that was really his forte. Another great film of the 40s I want to talk about is called Red River. When I talked about method acting a couple of weeks ago when we had a class, and we talked about James Dean and Marlon Brando, we talked about Montgomery Clift. And Montgomery Clift, this is his debut movie, came out about 1948, and it's a John Wayne movie, believe it or not. John Wayne plays an aging cattle baron sort of dude who takes a cattle drive from Texas up to the railroad crossing in Kansas. That's a long cattle drive. If anybody's ever moved a cow, and I got to go on a cattle drive once, and I thought it was going to be, because I thought it was like the movies, that everybody's going to be out there riding, roping fast. It's not. It's in slow motion, folks, because those cows move slow. Plus, you don't want to make them move fast or they lose too much weight. And so you're plopping along days on end, endless days of getting those little doggies moving. Very little chasing them down and roping them like they have in the movies. But anyway, Red River, directed by the great Howard Hawks, who directed many screwball comedies, from His Girl Friday to Bringing Up Baby. He was a master of the witty repartee, and he knew how to work in the system. And he put his personal stamp on these movies all the way up and to the 70s when he passed away. And he worked with John Wayne quite a bit, especially in the 50s, and in the 60s he even did when he made Rio Bravo, and later on he made El Dorado in 66, 67. So Howard Hawks loved the Western landscape. Ford, they felt they could tell their stories, Mann's epic story on an epic landscape instead of in a closed room. And there's no rooms in these movies. They're outside. It's the great outdoors and the danger and the weather and everything else that goes along with it. Anyway, those are some of the movies from that era. 1950s also saw George Stevens directing Shane. Now, you remember George Stevens, if you saw that documentary about the 5 directors who went to World War II, went to war, called 5 and Came Back. He was one of them. He had mostly in the early career, he directed kind of comedies and screwball comedies and musicals. And but when he got out of the war, he no longer wanted to do that. And so he made serious-minded films, and Shane was one of them. And about a gunslinger played by Alan Ladd who wants to retire. And, of course, the bad guys aren't going to let him retire. And so he has to put on the gun again, reluctantly. And he's idolized by a small child, Brandon DeWild, or DeWild, however you say his name. He was also in a great movie called HUD with Paul Newman, and died early in a car crash before he got to really mature into his 30s and 40s as an actor. Very sensitive actor. And Shane, this kid idolizes this guy who's trying to put down his guns. And if you know anything about the myth of these stories, that's not going to be possible. Clint Eastwood used the same scenario in Unforgiven. He was a guy trying to put down his guns. They're not going to let him put down the guns. And he is fated to be a gunman. And that's it. There's no other choice. And he finally realizes that at the end of the movie. Clint Eastwood at the end of Unforgiven finally realizes, this is what I am. This is what I do. Same thing with Shane. With Alan Ladd. Came out in 1950. Now, Westerns are changing now. Remember, we came out of the war. Huge world war where the whole world was ravaged. Our American psyche was ravaged. We no longer could sit back and just make simple stories, musicals, comedies. These filmmakers wanted to say something, and you could say something using the Western as a backdrop. Because once again, supposedly it's a lawless land, or the law is slow in coming there, and they could kind of keep the independent spirit of the American West alive a little longer before actual law shows up and puts the kibosh on that. Another film that came out in the 50s, High Noon, with Greg Cooper won the Academy Award for that. High Noon is about a sheriff. Maybe you've seen it. Hopefully you've seen some of these movies. I suggest you seek them out. When I give you guys an extra credit, this will be one of the movies you can write about. Any of these Westerns I'm mentioning, I'll post this in the extra credit. You can write a paper, a research paper, or an essay if you watch the movie. But don't if you don't watch the movie, you kind of need to do a research paper. And I'll explain all that in extra credit assignments. But what was I talking about? High Noon. Yeah, about a marshal who has to stand up against these hoodlums that are coming to his town. It's called High Noon because they're getting their noon. And he tries to get the town folks to help. He doesn't get any help. And it's an allegory about essentially, it could be an allegory about McCarthyism, communist witch hunt, but he is a lone man against these guys, and no one's going to help him. And he has to face them down. And so you're watching the whole time, the clock is ticking. It's getting closer and closer. And the stoic, minimalist actor, Gary Cooper, is at his height here. And he's not at the beginning of his career. He only had 10 more years to live, and this is possibly his last great moment. So High Noon is another one. And then a filmmaker who I really appreciate is Anthony Mann. Anthony Mann did these a series of Westerns. Most of them starred James Stewart. James Stewart was a happy-go-lucky actor in the 30s and 40s, and he came out of the World War II, a changed man like everybody else. His first movie he made was It's a Wonderful Life, about a guy trying to commit suicide. And it was a bummer, man, and nobody wanted to put it out, but they did put it out. And and it did not do well. In fact, James Stewart thought his career was over, but later on it became a perennial Christmas movie that maybe you watch it with your family to this day. Directed by Frank Capra, another one of those directors that went off to World War II from that documentary 5 came back. Anthony Mann took the dark side of human behavior, and even though James Stewart would be considered the hero of the piece, he's very flawed. All you have to do is watch Naked Spur. And Naked Spur, he's literally a man on a vengeance to bring back this bad outlaw, and no matter what. And even after he dies, he's dragging his dead body with him to get justice and the reward for this guy because he had been wronged before, and so you see this man who's supposedly the hero of the piece behaving like a savage. And later on, they did a movie together called Winchester 73, which was about the invention of this Winchester rifle that came out in 1873 and how it changed everything because it could repeat a lot and you could kill a lot of guys with it, or Indians. And once again, James Stewart is a flawed hero who ends up doing the right thing at the end of the day. They made half dozen films together by some horrible thing that happened in his past, family dying, whatever, and he is seeking revenge in some manner. And we never saw that before. We never saw such flawed heroes. Is he the hero of the piece? He is. Very flawed. So in the 50s, Bud Budigers was another filmmaker who made low-budget films, many starring. And in the 50s, he had a pretty steady career as a Western actor. They could produce these Westerns inexpensively, no sets. You could go out into the desert and film these things and watch a Bud Budigers film, and it's always about a very complex relationship between the good guy, which is Randolph Scott, and the bad guy, which is usually a lot of great character actors came through there, from Lee Marvin to Pernell Roberts from The Bonanza and others. And he told these complex stories about these men, how even though one's good and one's bad, they weren't that much different from each other. And they have a mutual respect for each other. And one of them's going to have to die at the end. And usually it's the bad guy. Anthony Mann went on to make a brutal Western called Man of the West, with Gary Cooper, Lee J. Cobb, Julie London, and it's brutal. There is a would-be rape scene in this movie with Jack Lord, the actor who went on to portray Steve McGarrett in the series Hawaii Five-0, and he's going to rape Julie London, who was the femme fatale in the story, and it's brutal. His punishment is brutal. It's a very raw Western, and Gary Cooper is not a perfect guy. He's not the perfect hero because he used to run with the same gang that now is tormenting everybody, and he wanted out, but he couldn't get back. He couldn't get out, so they drug him back in. Man of the West. They wouldn't have made this movie in the 30s or 40s. It had been too brutal. But now we're into post-World War II, and we're into the nuclear age and the Cold War and the communist witch hunts. Things are changing in the culture. And people just aren't accepting the lightweight, frivolous melodramas of before. They needed something with substance, and they gave it to them. As we go into the 60s, we start the decade off, 1960 or so, with The Magnificent Seven, John Sturges film. And John Sturges had a healthy career directing very male-oriented movies. He also directed The Great Escape and others. This movie is a legendary movie because it brought together about some would-be stars that they weren't totally stars yet. They will become stars. Maybe seen at The Magnificent Seven with Yul Brynner, Steve Mcqueen. Steve McQueen had a series already called Wanted Dead or Alive. This movie made him a huge star. He quit that series and made movies the rest of his life, but also made movie stars of James Coburn, Robert Vaughn, who went on to star in the TV series Man from U.N.C.L.E., Charles Bronson, folks. So it made stars of these people. This is like their first kind of movie that put them on the map. They'd been making movies before. Charles Bronson made a bunch of movies before, not under his name though, his actual Polish name, which I don't want to mangle by mispronouncing it. And he usually played Indians. But this one, he's he's not an Indian, he's a gunfighter. And maybe you know the story. This village in Mexico hires these 7 gunfighters that don't have any money to fight off these bad banditos. They're outnumbered, but 7 against 50, 60, and the great Eli Wallach. Here we have a Jewish New York actor playing a Mexican bandito. That would never happen again. Too bad, but he does a great job as this Mexican bandito. Anyway, the good guys win. There's a big loss, and the day of the gunfighter is definitely over. But they had their one more day. Now that movie is based on a very, very famous Japanese movie by Kurosawa called The Seventh Samurai. You need to watch that. In fact, if anybody wants to write an extra credit paper, watch The Seventh Samurai or do an essay on it. I'll post that also. Kurosawa cannot be underestimated. I know we've been sticking American films lately, but Kurosawa changed everything in Japanese cinema and world cinema. And with his movies like this. And it's about 7 samurais who are defending a village against bad samurais. And the movie Magnificent Seven follows the story almost exactly, except for instead of gun battles, they have sword fights in beautiful downpouring rain. I wish I could show you guys some clips right now. I would if we were in class, but seek it out. You can see it on YouTube. See the clips at least. The beautiful black and white photography. Kurosawa was directing movies up until World War II, and then he was not allowed to make any movies. But as soon as the war was over, but we still occupied Japan, he started making films again. And this was one of them, about 1954. But he made Rashomon, which is another famous movie of that era. He made a movie called Hidden Fortress. And I know you Star Wars zealots out there will appreciate this. Hidden Fortress is what George Lucas based Star Wars on. No, Hidden Fortress is not set in outer space, but it's very similar characters, similar storyline, and Lucas in many interviews said, my template for Star Wars is the Hidden Fortress. Does that pique your interest? You all like Star Wars. Check out Hidden Fortress and tell me if you can spot the similarities in Star Wars and this movie that was made in the 1950s. Kurosawa had a great career. He went on and on, lived until the early 90s. He knew how to direct epic, his main influence. He loved John Ford. They had a love of military things, battle sequences, with beautiful imagery on devastating landscapes. Anyway, true master of cinema. That was happening in the early 60s. Another film around that time came out a little later called The Professionals, and directed by Richard Brooks, who I had a pleasure of meeting one time when I lived in Hollywood. Professionals, made in about 1966, about a group of hired guns who have to go to Mexico to re-kidnap a beautiful woman and bring her back to her rich husband. And it's just very, very highly entertaining. Richard Brooks knows how to entertain people in his movies. And this Western is very entertaining, but it's set in an interesting time in our American history. It's set literally during World War I. And so even though they're on horseback and they have modern weaponry, meaning they have machine guns, sort of machine guns, and the Old West is definitely collapsing. And they're down in Mexico during the time of the Revolution, and with Pancho Villa fighting the Revolution. Anyway, and then another film that closed off the 60s, closed, I would say, closed down. It's the it's the definitive Western to end all Westerns. It's called The Wild Bunch by Sam Peckinpah. Set once again in Mexico during the time of World War I, which is when the Mexican Revolution was going on down there. And Pancho Villa and the rest were fighting for their independence against foreign intruders who had taken over their country from Germany and France. And Peckinpah's movie is a masterpiece. It's a movie that's affected me all my life more than any other. When I first saw it, I was a youngster, 17 or so, in 1969, and it changed my world. It made me want to do that, write and direct movies if I could. I still want to do that. Anyway, but it's what they would call, he's closing the door on Westerns, and we never had many Westerns after that, because the next generation, which would be the generation a little younger than me, was so enamored of Star Wars, that became the new West. Outer space became the new Western. And they didn't want to see guys on horseback. They wanted to see people zapping each other with ray guns, and so that was the new Western. And if you look at most space movies, they're essentially Westerns set in outer space. And now I don't know what's next. We're still making a few Westerns every once in a while. They still pop their heads out. My dream is always to make a Western, a low budget film noir Western. Black and white, a couple guys chasing each other on horseback for 2 hours and talking existential angst. I still hope to do that one day. Anyway, on that, please keep up on the assignments. Look at my notes. I put a list out there for the research papers you could do. I'll put some lists out there for some extra credit assignments. Westerns will definitely be on there. And I hope you guys are getting through this, managing this new world order we're living in. And I hope you're still keeping the faith with not just yourself and your dreams, but your families and with cinema. Because no matter how I bash new cinema, I believe everything is cinema. And it's been my life's blood. And it's what keeps me going. This week, I just thought I'd tell you, I did see John Wick. I'll talk about that next week. And I saw Zombieland double tap. Okay, you know what I'm going to say about it. It's a lot of shooting, and Woody Harrelson just loves shooting zombies. He gets too much of enjoyment out of it. Anyway, there's no terror in it. You're never afraid that anything's going to happen to him, because he's a real jerk. To me, he's a jerk. He just wants to kill. He goes, I'm good at this, and there's no consequences. And but I don't know if we'll see another sequel, but it made a bunch of money, so maybe we will. Anyway, with that message, keep the faith, stay healthy, scrub your hands, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.